From the moment he arrived at the prison, it was clear that this man was unlike any other inmate. He wasn't like the hardened criminals, the petty thieves, or the desperate men who had found themselves trapped in this world of metal and concrete. No. He was different. Special, or so he believed. His name was Alex Turner, a name that had once been synonymous with success, wealth, and the kind of power that only money could buy. His family had been influential, his connections deep, and his pockets always full. To him, the prison gates were just another obstacle, one he could easily navigate. After all, when you have enough resources, it's hard to imagine that anything can touch you. When he was processed, it was like the guards didn't know what to do with him. The usual orange jumpsuit, the uniform of the convicted, didn't suit him. So, his lawyers had arranged something else. Custom-tailored prison wear in a shade of navy that looked more like something you'd find in a 5-star hotel than a penitentiary. He was treated with a reverence no one else got. His cell furnished with extras, a better mattress, a desk, a few luxuries that were reserved for those with a substantial bank account. It was clear that his wealth spoke louder than any other inmate's past. The other prisoners were a mix of resentment, curiosity, and disdain. They were used to the cold, harsh environment of prison life, where survival came down to strength, wit, or alliances. But here was this man, easily well-fed, with manicured hair and a fresh face, who seemed to think he could get by just as easily in this place as he did in his lavish penthouse. He ignored the usual prison etiquette, sneering at the guards who tried to maintain order, treating them as though they were beneath him. His insults were wrapped in sharp sarcasm, his tone mocking, as though he believed he could buy them all off or simply overpower them with his charm. And the way he spoke to the inmates was no different. He looked down on them as if their troubles were nothing more than annoyances to be dealt with. It didn't take long for the other prisoners to recognize that Alex wasn't afraid of anything, except maybe losing his privileges. His sense of invincibility was so profound, it was almost comical. He walked with a swagger, his eyes always scanning the room, making sure everyone noticed his presence. For a while, no one challenged him, not directly. They observed, biding their time, understanding that such arrogance often had a way of unraveling itself. But there was one guard who didn't buy into Alex's act. Officer Jameson was a man who had seen it all in his years of service. He didn't respond to wealth, power, or threats. What he valued was respect. You earned respect in prison through hard work, through the way you carried yourself, and by following the rules. Alex, however, seemed to think that everything could be bought, respect included. And that was a mistake. Officer Jameson was in his late 40s, grizzled and worn from years of serving in one of the toughest prisons in the country. His large frame was a physical presence, but it was his eyes that caught your attention first. Sharp, calculating, and unblinking. When Alex first arrived, Jameson had watched him closely, noting how he tried to charm the other officers, how he thought his wealth could shield him from the daily grind of prison life. The officer saw through the act, recognizing it for what it was, desperation masquerading as confidence. And he wasn't impressed. Over the course of several days, Alex grew bolder in his behavior. He mocked Jameson's uniform, calling him just another cog in the machine. When Jameson told him to get back in line during one of the routine head counts, Alex rolled his eyes and said, "I've paid for worse than this," in a dismissive tone that carried throughout the hall. His arrogance was now on full display, and it irritated not just Jameson, but every inmate who had seen someone like Alex before, people who thought they were untouchable because of their wealth or status. But Jameson knew better than to let it slide. He had spent enough time in the system to know that disrespect had a price, and it was only a matter of time before Alex would push too far. It wasn't long before the inevitable confrontation occurred. Alex had been pacing in front of his cell, enjoying the small amount of attention he garnered from the other prisoners. He had a small audience, 2 or 3 inmates hanging on to his every word as he complained about the food, about the conditions, and about the guards. As usual, Jameson was nearby, stationed a few feet away as part of the routine surveillance. "What's the matter, Jameson?" Alex sneered, not even trying to hide his contempt. "Can't afford a better uniform? Looks like a cheap knockoff." Jameson didn't flinch. He had heard it all before, but this time was different. Alex was becoming a problem, a reminder of the people who never understood the true nature of power. He was testing the boundaries, and that's when it happened. Alex, thinking he was untouchable, stepped even closer to Jameson. His face twisted into a grin, his arrogance now fully on display. "You know, I could buy your way out of here if I wanted to," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "If you don't start showing me some respect, I might just make you disappear." He stepped back with a satisfied look, believing that his words had the intended effect. Jameson would back off. But instead, the guard's expression hardened, and before Alex could say another word, the guard took a step forward. And then Alex spat. A deliberate, venomous spit aimed directly at Jameson's face. The sound of it hitting the officer's cheek was so loud, so sharp, it echoed through the prison. For a moment, there was stunned silence. Alex's smirk only widened, as though he had won. The other inmates began to whisper, their eyes wide with anticipation. They had never seen someone spit in a guard's face before, let alone a man like Alex. Surely there would be a violent retaliation. Everyone waited for the guard to snap, to beat him down for the humiliation. But what happened next left everyone stunned. Jameson didn't move. He didn't even flinch. His eyes stayed locked on Alex's, unblinking, as though nothing had happened. Alex, now confident that he had pushed the guard to his limit, took a step back, waiting for the explosion. But there was no explosion. Instead, Jameson just wiped the spit from his face, slowly, carefully, and then with a calm voice that cut through the silence, he said, "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." The words hung in the air, carrying a weight that Alex couldn't understand. He was used to being the one who controlled the narrative. But Jameson's cool response was something entirely different, something he hadn't prepared for. For the next few days, something changed in the air. The atmosphere around Alex grew tense, but not in the way he expected. No guards came after him, with fists raised or reprimands in hand. There were no immediate threats, no violent retribution, nothing that resembled the punishment he thought he was due. But the silence, the eerie stillness that surrounded him, was far more unnerving than any physical retaliation could have been. At first, Alex thought it was just another part of the prison game. He had been locked away for months now, sure, but this was still a world he could control. He had dealt with more difficult situations than this before. After all, in the real world, his wealth had always been his shield. His ability to maneuver and manipulate had been his sword. But here, behind these walls, his money meant little. So, when the guards began to ignore him, Alex assumed it was just a phase, a kind of passive rebellion he could easily brush off. He continued his usual routine, pacing his cell, taunting the inmates and throwing out insults at anyone who dared to approach him. But instead of meeting the usual reactions, grumbling, arguments, laughter, he was met with cold indifference. At first, he dismissed it. maybe they were just tired of his games. But as the days wore on, the silence became oppressive. No one responded when he spoke. His insults hung in the air, unanswered. The other inmates, those whom he had previously mocked and belittled, no longer flinched at his presence. They simply looked through him as if he didn't exist. He tried pushing further, making jokes, asking for special privileges, but the same result: nothing. Then came the real turning point. His meals, the gourmet food he had been enjoying for weeks, suddenly stopped arriving. The usual delivery of fresh fruit, high-quality meats, and special requests from his lawyer were gone. For the first time in months, Alex found himself sitting in his cell with nothing more than the bland, tasteless prison food that everyone else had to endure. It was a sharp contrast to the life he had lived just outside the prison walls, where he was accustomed to having only the finest. He immediately called the guards, demanding an explanation, but no one came. No one responded to his requests or complaints. The officers simply continued with their duties, as if he hadn't spoken at all. The inmates, too, paid him no mind. Alex began to realize that his status, his wealth, meant absolutely nothing here. The rules of the outside world no longer applied to him. This place had its own code, its own system, and he had been a fool to think that he could simply buy his way through it. The more he tried to force attention, the more distant everything became. The cold indifference of the other inmates was like a slow-burning fire. It was worse than hostility, worse than hatred. They were treating him as though he were invisible. When he passed by their cells, they turned their backs. When he tried to engage in conversation, they either ignored him completely or gave him a single, dismissive glance. There were no more whispers, no more mocking. It was as if the world around him had become a void. The loneliness was suffocating, the kind that creeps under your skin and settles in your bones. It wasn't just the inmates who avoided him. The guards, too, began to change. It started with subtle gestures, avoiding eye contact, turning their heads when he tried to catch their attention. The small talk he used to exchange with them when he'd try to bribe them or convince them of his importance was met with nothing more than terse nods or complete silence. The very authority that had once given him a sense of control over the environment was now slipping through his fingers like sand. It was as if they had all collectively decided that he didn't matter anymore. This gradual descent into isolation felt like a slow death. Alex couldn't escape the reality of his situation. He was no longer the rich inmate who walked the halls with an air of superiority. He was just another prisoner, an insignificant one at that. His attempts to regain his position, his sense of importance, fell flat. He wasn't in control of the narrative anymore. The more he tried to assert himself, the further the prison walls seemed to close in on him. One evening, he found himself sitting alone in his cell, staring out through the bars at the bleak horizon. His body felt heavy, weighed down by the realization that he had no power here. He had been so sure that he could buy respect, that his wealth would somehow shield him from the harsh realities of prison life. But now, with every passing day, that illusion shattered further. The one thing he had always taken for granted, his ability to influence others, was slipping from his grasp. That night, he sat in silence, replaying the events in his mind. The incident with Jameson had triggered something in the guards and the inmates. They had all come together, consciously or unconsciously, to make him feel the full weight of what he had done. In the outside world, Alex had always been a person who could manipulate situations, who could buy his way out of trouble with a few phone calls or a check. But here, in this prison, he was nothing more than a man in a cage, and it terrified him. He couldn't deny it anymore. Jameson had won the guard's response to the spit. His calm demeanor had been a kind of psychological warfare Alex hadn't anticipated. In prison, physical violence wasn't the only form of punishment. The quiet, steady erosion of a man's dignity, taking away everything he once held dear, was far more brutal. And as Alex lay in his bed, staring at the chipped walls of his cell, he finally understood what Jameson had meant by his words. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." Jameson hadn't reacted with anger or violence because he didn't need to. He had understood that true power didn't lie in controlling others through wealth or force. It lay in the ability to make someone realize that they were completely powerless, to strip them of everything they believed they were. The silence continued, and Alex began to feel it deep in his bones. The luxury of his past life, the world where he had been untouchable, now felt like a distant dream, one that was fading away, slowly but surely, in the dim, grey world of the prison. He could no longer hide behind his money. He could no longer demand respect from people who saw right through him. He was just another inmate now. And that realization, more than anything else, was the punishment he could never have prepared for. As the days dragged on, Alex's existence within the prison became a cruel parody of the life he once knew. What had once been a world of privilege and status now felt like an unending cycle of isolation and despair. He had no allies left, no one to turn to. His wealth was useless here. His name carried no weight. All of his past achievements and connections had no relevance in a place where the only currency that mattered was survival. Every morning, Alex awoke to the same cold, dimly lit cell. The walls, once so sterile and unblemished, now seemed to close in on him. The thought of it, the grey concrete, the iron bars, the unyielding routine of prison life, felt suffocating. But the real torment wasn't the physical discomfort. It was the absence of power, the loss of control. In the outside world, he had been someone. In here, he was nothing. The more time he spent in prison, the more he began to realize that he was being consumed by the place and not the other way around. He had tried everything to get the other inmates to recognize him, to see him as someone of importance. At first, he threw money at the problem, offering bribes for favors, promising luxuries in exchange for respect. But the response had been the same: indifference, avoidance, and an occasional insult. No one wanted anything to do with him, and it wasn't just the inmates. The guards, who had once been his potential allies, now treated him like a nuisance. Their cold, professional demeanor was punctuated by their refusal to acknowledge his existence. He had tried to push back in subtle ways, attempting to manipulate situations in his favor. There were moments when he would demand special treatment, expecting that the usual tactics of charm and coercion would work. But the prison had its own rules, its own system of hierarchy that he simply couldn't navigate with money or arrogance. His behavior only alienated him further. His attempts to charm the guards had been met with dismissive responses, and his requests for privileges, once granted easily in the world he had left behind, were denied without hesitation. Even the luxuries that had been granted to him early on were slowly stripped away. One morning, as he sat in his cell staring out at the bleak courtyard, Alex was confronted with a painful reality. He had no one left. The guards weren't his allies, and the inmates were a reminder of his own insignificance. His status had been nothing more than an illusion, a construct that had protected him from the raw truths of the world around him. But in the prison, that illusion had shattered. Now, all he had left was his mind, and it was beginning to betray him. It was a strange feeling, the way the mind begins to eat itself when there's nothing else to distract it, The loneliness, the isolation, it all seeped into his thoughts. He found himself replaying the moment when he had spat on Officer Jameson's face. The arrogance he had felt in that moment now seemed childish, reckless. What had he been trying to prove? That his wealth made him untouchable? That he could defy the very authority that held him in place? All it had done was make him a target for the very people he had dismissed. And yet what haunted him the most was the moment that followed. The one in which Officer Jameson had wiped the spit off his cheek and said, "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." Those words had echoed in his mind for days, replaying over and over like a broken record. He had been so sure that he could make it in this world, that his money would somehow buy him the respect he felt he deserved. But Jameson's calm response, his refusal to react with violence or anger, had shattered that perception. Jameson had shown him something that Alex couldn't ignore. It wasn't the physical strength of the guards, nor their ability to keep control over the inmates. It was their emotional discipline, their patience, and the way they had mastered the art of dealing with powerlessness. They didn't need to exert control in the way Alex had expected. Instead, they had something far more potent, an inner peace that came from knowing they were in control of themselves. They didn't need to dominate the world around them. They could simply exist within it. This realization gnawed at him. What was worse than physical defeat was the defeat of the mind, the knowledge that you could not buy your way out of a situation, that your wealth, your name, and your history counted for nothing when it came to the core of who you were. In a place like this, where everything was stripped down to its rawest form, Alex found himself face to face with the truth. He was vulnerable. He was powerless, and there was nothing he could do to escape it. At first, he fought the truth. He tried to convince himself that there was still a way out, a way to turn things around. He started making plans that involved leveraging his connections outside the prison, manipulating the weak-willed inmates, and using the guards as pawns in a game of influence. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that these plans were nothing more than a last-ditch effort to hold onto a world that no longer existed. His mind kept returning to the words of Officer Jameson, "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." It was a mistake that went beyond his actions in the prison. It was the realization that he had never truly understood what power was. He had thought that power came from money, from influence, from the ability to bend the world to your will. But what if true power wasn't about any of that? What if it came from the ability to endure, to find strength within yourself when everything around you was falling apart? The more Alex dwelled on this idea, the more he began to understand that the thing he had been missing all along was inner peace. Jameson's calm response, his refusal to let Alex's spit or insults rattle him, was not a sign of weakness but of strength. It wasn't the guard who had been humiliated that day. It was Alex. He had thought that he could break the system with a single act of defiance, but in reality, it had only exposed his own weaknesses. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing moment, Alex became more introspective. He stopped trying to assert his dominance, stopped looking for ways to manipulate his surroundings. Instead, he spent hours in his cell, contemplating the nature of power and control. He began to realize that in the world outside, he had been a king without a kingdom. And now, in this prison, he was a man who had lost everything. But the most surprising change came not in his external circumstances, but within himself. He began to understand the value of humility. The power that had once been alluring, the ability to control, to manipulate, to buy anything he wanted, was fleeting, hollow. The real strength he now saw lay in acceptance, in the ability to withstand hardship without breaking, to endure the pain without letting it consume you. It wasn't an easy lesson to learn. The old Alex, the one who had been driven by ambition, ego, and the need for validation, fought against it every step of the way. But slowly, imperceptibly, he began to change. He found solace in the quiet moments, in the stillness of his cell, where the constant hum of his thoughts could finally settle. The realization that power was not something you could buy, that it was something you had to cultivate within yourself, was a bitter pill to swallow. But as the days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, Alex began to realize that he was no longer the man who had walked through those prison gates with an air of superiority. He was something else now, something far more dangerous, not in the traditional sense, but in a way he could never have anticipated. He was beginning to understand that true strength came not from what you could take from the world, but from what you could endure. And in the prison's harsh, unforgiving world, Alex was starting to endure. The transformation in Alex was not immediate, nor was it linear. It came in fragments, in moments of realization that crashed over him like waves, each one wearing away at the foundation of the man he used to be, the arrogance, the entitlement, the belief that he was somehow immune to consequence. All of it had been slowly chipped away until all that remained was the raw, unfiltered truth of his existence. He had lost everything, and yet, in losing everything, he had gained something he never knew he needed: clarity. One day, as he sat alone in the prison yard watching the way the sunlight barely managed to break through the heavy steel fences, he caught sight of Officer Jameson. The man who had once been the target of his disdain now seemed different in Alex's eyes. Jameson was not a faceless cog in the system, nor was he a man who wielded power for the sake of control. He was something else entirely. A man who had learned to navigate the brutal realities of life without being consumed by them. For the first time, Alex truly saw him. The sharp, watchful eyes, the way his posture was always steady, unmoved by the chaos around him. There was something in the way Jameson carried himself that Alex envied, not his authority, but his composure. It was the kind of strength Alex had never understood, the kind that came not from wealth or status, but from within. The memory of spitting in Jameson's face still haunted him, but now, instead of feeling the smug satisfaction he had once relished, he felt something different. Shame. Not because of the consequences he had suffered, but because of what the act itself revealed about him. He had been so desperate to assert dominance, to prove that he was untouchable, that he had resorted to the kind of behavior he would have once mocked in others. The act had not made him powerful. It had made him pathetic. Weeks passed and something shifted within Alex. He no longer carried himself with the same defensive arrogance. He no longer tried to win favor with the inmates or demand respect from the guards. Instead, he withdrew into himself, not out of fear, but out of a desire to understand. Who was he now? What was left of him without the power and privilege that had once defined his every move? And then, one day, something happened that neither Alex nor anyone else in the prison expected. It was a tense afternoon. The air in the prison was heavy, charged with the kind of restless energy that always preceded something violent. The inmates were irritable, on edge. Rumors had been circulating about an impending fight between two rival groups, and everyone knew that when conflict erupted in prison, it was never just between two people. Alex had learned to recognize the signs. The hushed or hushed conversations, the way certain inmates kept glancing at each other, the subtle shifts in body language. He knew something was about to happen, and yet, for the first time, he felt no desire to involve himself. He simply observed. And then chaos struck. It happened in an instant. A loud, guttural shout cut through the tension, followed by the unmistakable sound of fists colliding with flesh. Bodies lunged at one another, fists and makeshift weapons swinging wildly. The guards moved in fast, but not fast enough. It was a riot, and in the middle of it all was Officer Jameson. Alex wasn't sure what made him move. Perhaps it was instinct. Perhaps it was something deeper, something that had been stirring inside him for weeks, waiting for the right moment to surface. He saw Jameson struggling, surrounded by inmates who had been waiting for an opportunity to strike back at the system. Jameson fought, but he was outnumbered. One inmate lunged at him from behind, and without thinking, Alex moved. He didn't have a plan. He didn't stop to consider the consequences. All he knew was that in that moment, he couldn't stand by and watch. He grabbed the attacking inmate, pulling him back just enough for Jameson to regain his footing. It was a split-second decision, but it changed everything. The fight was over as quickly as it had begun. Reinforcements arrived, the guards regained control, and the inmates who had started the riot were dragged away. Alex expected to be treated like just another participant, another name on the list of troublemakers who would be punished, but that didn't happen. Instead, Jameson turned to him. Their eyes met, and for the first time there was something in the guard's expression that Alex had never seen before. Not anger, not resentment, just quiet understanding. He didn't say anything at first. He simply studied Alex, as if trying to make sense of what had just happened. And then, in a voice that was calm but firm, he said, "You didn't have to do that." Alex shrugged, feeling an unfamiliar weight lift from his shoulders. "I know," he replied. Jameson nodded slowly, as if recognizing something in Alex that even Alex himself had only just begun to see. The incident didn't erase the past. It didn't make up for the mistakes Alex had made, or the arrogance he had once carried, but it changed something. It was the first time in his life that he had acted without selfish intent, without expectation of reward. And in that moment, for the first time in a long time, Alex felt free.